deep folds of medieval society, where life was hard and harvests were tenuous, certainty was a rare luxury. The human spirit, confronted by inexplicable suffering, the sudden blight upon the crops, the child gripped by a fever that defied herbal remedies, the livestock stolen under the cloak of night, had a desperate need for an explanation. And often, when nature failed to provide one, suspicion filled the void. A small village nestled in the muddy delta between desperation and faith was not immune. Here, too, tragedy did not strike randomly. It accumulated, gathering weight until it felt less like bad luck and more like a targeted assault. The initial concerns were mundane enough. An elder's meal found tainted, a prized cow vanishing into the fog, sick animals dying with uncanny speed. These were small ripples of fear, easily dismissed as coincidence or the vagaries of fate. But in these communities, tragedy did not remain isolated. It was infectious. The first whispers of malfeasance rarely concerned magic itself. They worried about jealousy. Jealousy, a raw, primal force that had always found purchase among men and women alike. Or perhaps they worried about rivals, those who stood to gain from misfortune. The narrative began slowly, building like smoke in a tight space, fueled by half-truths and mutual accusation. The subtle shift occurred when the circumstantial bled into the spiritual. A bad harvest was not simply due to drought. It was blamed on an unnatural anger directed at the village's piety. The sickness that took the young woman was not merely natural decay. It was painted as a consequence of forbidden knowledge, whispered secrets passed in the dark. People were beginning to believe they were under siege. They felt watched by something unseen, something malevolent, and profoundly personal. When conventional explanations failed, when prayer provided no respite, when remedies proved useless against death, the logical mind often surrendered to the supernatural. The devil became an immensely practical scapegoat, a single entity capable of explaining every inexplicable failure, every untimely death, every streak of bad luck. This was not simply religious fervor. It was institutional paranoia taking root in fertile ground. It found purchase where the authority of the church struggled against the brutal immediacy of daily survival. The common anxieties, the struggle for food, the uncertainty of marriage, the weight of debt, were channeled into a terrifying, unifying focus: accusation. To name the enemy was to organize themselves, to regain a semblance of control over chaos. The suspicion did not target one group. It spread like fungal mold across the village structure. It began subtly with those who lived slightly outside accepted norms. The hedge witch who gathered herbs from the forbidden woods, the poor widow whose life had been marked by successive misfortunes, the local healer who spoke of correspondences between stars and ailments. These were people whose existence challenged the settled understanding of order. The seeds of suspicion, therefore, were sown in necessity. When a community loses its moorings, when the crops fail, when the sick die, when social bonds fray under economic pressure, the first instinct is to find an external enemy. It was easier, psychologically, to believe that fate was controlled by an opposing force than to confront the terrifying contingency of random suffering. The local magistrate, armed with newfound religious zeal and a growing confidence in his authority, began to encourage these nascent suspicions. He did not need proof. He needed only sufficient conjecture. The process became highly formalized, transforming neighborly worry into prosecutable grievance. The concept of the Devil's Covenant was introduced, offering a comprehensive framework for guilt. If you were unwell or poor or unlucky, it could be because you had sold your soul. This narrative provided not only an explanation, but also a solution. It offered the community a participatory ritual, confession and denunciation. The power to accuse became a temporary shield against helplessness. In accusing another, one momentarily felt safe from the abyss of fate itself. The paranoia was masterful in its architecture. It did not require monstrous, obvious evidence. It merely required sustained belief. A whisper overheard near the tannery could become testimony to satanic rites. A peculiar dream experienced by a village woman could be presented as proof of demonic visitation. Small grievances were amplified until they sounded like cosmic betrayals. The transition from local folklore, the old cautionary tales told around dying fires about malevolent spirits, to formalized criminal enterprise was gradual, sickeningly so. The spiritual concept bled into the legal system, transforming matters of heresy and misfortune into capital crimes punishable by fire. The boundary between piety and persecution dissolved until only fear remained. By the end of this initial phase of suspicion, the village had learned a terrible lesson: that the deepest threat did not come from the wild woods or from foreign armies, but from the neighbor's suspicious glance, amplified by institutional failure, turning profound existential dread into meticulously woven threads of accusation. The fertile ground of fear was ready to receive the next crop. Structured evidence and righteous conviction, the desperation of the village, having transformed simple worry into spiritual grievance, left its accusers grasping for any shred of coherent explanation. If sickness was not from a curse, and poor harvests were not from jealous spirits, then they turned their gaze upward. They began to look for order in the chaos, demanding that even the inexplicable must adhere to a recognizable system, a cosmic law only God, or perhaps malevolent forces mimicking it, could reveal. This was the intellectual scaffolding built upon raw fear, the imposition of pseudo-scientific theory onto the brutal reality of human misery. In this chapter, we are pulled into the dusty lecture halls and manicured theological treatises that sought to rationalize witchcraft. It was a process of magnificent misinterpretation. The practitioners of science and piety alike struggled with an immense intellectual vacuum, and when traditional astrology failed to explain why certain crops died in specific fields, they found it easier to point at a neighbor's womb than to acknowledge the unpredictable nature of the earth itself. The theory that emerged was deeply complex, yet ultimately facile. Witchcraft became inextricably linked not just to sin, but to the heavens themselves. The stars were no longer merely guides for sailors. They became a cosmic barometer, measuring spiritual decay and human sexual transgression. Constellations were read by those who possessed enough literacy or pretension to claim such knowledge. Alchemists mixed with learned priests. They claimed that specific alignments of planets, particularly during certain lunar cycles, opened temporary pathways between the earthly realm and the infernal one. Consider the intricate web they spun. Menstrual cycles became entangled with planetary transits. The natural rhythm of a woman's body was mapped against the rigid geometry of the zodiac. To be fertile, to bleed, to experience change. These were not merely biological facts. They were viewed as deviations from divine order, ripe for demonic exploitation. A woman's supposed deviation in her cycle could thus be read as proof of a temporary pact, an astrological opening through which the devil might exert his subtle influence. This fusion was profoundly misogynistic. The body of the woman was treated as an unstable instrument, perpetually fluctuating in value according to both lunar phases and celestial mechanics. Her unique biological rhythms, dismissed by men as mere natural occurrence, were instead given a dramatic, terrifying spiritual significance. She was inherently volatile, cosmically aligned with change, a mutable vessel for sin. The literature of the time provided a ready-made architecture for this terror. Pseudo-scientific texts began to mingle astrological charts with theological pronouncements. They did not merely accuse, they offered meticulously detailed, if utterly fraudulent, blueprints of how magic worked. Through sympathetic correspondences, through lunar influence, and through the corruption of natural bodily functions. The failure here was threefold. First, it was a massive institutional failure of the Church's intellectual guardrails. The established understanding of sin had been challenged by Renaissance humanism and burgeoning scientific inquiry. Rather than adapting to new knowledge, new concepts of anatomy, mechanics, or astronomy, the theological establishment reacted with panic, reinforcing its old fears using the newest vocabulary. Second, it was a failure of medical objectivity. Physicians were often forced to synthesize esoteric astrological theory with clinical observation. If an ailment could not be explained by humors or physical imbalance, they sought celestial blame. This created an intellectual mandate. Everything unusual must have a hidden cosmic cause, And when the most visible, unusual subject was women who lived outside the domestic sphere, herbalists, midwives, poor single mothers, they became primary suspects. Third, it speaks to the terrible power of pattern recognition when that pattern is entirely artificial. The complex narratives offered by these pseudoscientists provided a comforting illusion of control. Instead of accepting the brutal randomness of famine, plague, or childbirth complications, they could now construct a magnificent, visible enemy, an astrological and theological conspiracy orchestrated from both the deepest forest and the highest plane of the heavens. The result was the perfect intellectual weapon against the individual woman. She was not simply suspected of harming livestock. She was accused of having maligned her own blood, her cycle, in communion with a planetary force, rendering her physically unnatural and spiritually compromised. The star map became the indictment, turning the natural rhythms of life into evidence of damnation. These theories were elaborate scaffolding erected around profound human discomfort. They allowed the powerful to rationalize suspicion by wrapping it in layers of arcane knowledge. By proving that an accusation was rooted in cosmic truth, they immunized themselves from doubt and skepticism. It transformed simple, neighborly mistrust, born of scarcity and grief, into something official, intellectually sound, and therefore irresistible. The darkness of the hunt, we learn here, was not only found at the edge of the woods. It was calculated out among the starlight, etched onto vellum in the language of forbidden knowledge. We have journeyed into the raw paranoia of the medieval village, understanding how basic hardship could transform random suffering into grand spiritual warfare. We saw how a misplaced sheaf of grain or an inexplicable fever could be reframed as evidence of a covenant with darkness. But suspicion alone is just a volatile chemical. It requires structure, a mechanism for combustion. And that mechanism was the trial itself. The courtroom, we must understand, was rarely a place of objective justice. It was, instead, a theatrical stage, a morbid performance designed not to discover truth, but to confirm pre-existing terror. Entering this space, we confront the idea that accusation functioned less as an allegation and more as a form of community catharsis. The trial became a spectacle for both the frightened populace in the galleries and the desperate inquisitors on stage. The lines between justice, entertainment, and self-flagellation blurred into a single, terrifying smear. The formal structure provided a semblance of order that was utterly superficial. It presented itself as a sacred pursuit, a holy cleansing of the community. But beneath the veneer of piety lay nothing but cynical ambition and institutional failure. The goal was not exoneration, it was confession. And in this pressurized environment, confessing became an act of survival, often far more dangerous than any initial accusation. The accuser carried a terrifying authority. They were granted the role of spiritual detective, tasked with peeling back layers of normalcy to reveal the hidden corruption within their neighbor. Their testimony, fueled by fear and sometimes outright malice, possessed staggering legal weight. To challenge an accusation was not merely to dispute facts. It was to question divine intervention itself. But the most insidious element of this theatrical performance was the invention of evidence. Since true proof, fingerprints, motive, indisputable wrongdoing was largely unavailable or dismissed as insufficient, authorities developed methods that allowed suspicion to become fact. The primary tool, the crowning literary device of the witch trial, was the coerced confession. Confession was designed not by finding truth, but by creating it. It followed a predictable, horrifying trajectory, denial leading to pleading, and pleading leading inexorably to the most damning details, no matter how fantastical or impossible they seemed. The accused were expected to relinquish their independent will, trading reality for temporary reprieve. To confess means admitting guilt. To admit guilt in that system was often equivalent to condemning oneself. Furthermore, we encounter the grotesque machinery of spectral evidence. This concept allowed the invisible world to enter the courtroom with devastating clarity. An accuser could swear by dreams or visions that a spirit had tormented them, that they had witnessed an unearthly pact, or even that they had seen the devil himself whispering names in their sleep. Such accounts bypassed the need for physical corroboration entirely. These spectral testimonies were powerful because they appealed directly to the deepest recesses of shared belief and fear. What could one know about evil save through divine affliction? The trial space became a nexus where intellectual theory, the connection between stars and sin, or botany and malediction, met with raw psychological terror. The Inquisition process demanded that every aspect of life be scrutinized under the microscope of suspicion. Was her unusual knowledge of herbs benign healing? Or was it merely an arcane skill gleaned from forbidden texts? Was his deep melancholy a sign of spiritual weakness, or something far darker? This constant state of performance put immense pressure on everyone involved. For the accused, the ordeal was designed to dismantle them piece by piece. They were subjected to relentless interrogation, shifting accusations from minor indiscretions to grand treason against God and order. The physical exhaustion, the emotional drain of maintaining an impossible narrative of innocence, combined with systemic terror, created a vacuum that forced confessions into existence. The courtroom became a dark feedback loop. Fear generated suspicion. Suspicion mandated the trial. The procedural demands of the trial necessitated confession, and the coerced confession validated the initial fear, thereby justifying the next wave of accusations. It was an ecosystem built entirely on panic, where institutional authority provided the framework for profitable paranoia. This systematic process reveals a profound failure of human governance. The laws were not designed to protect the innocent. They were perfectly structured to capture and neutralize deviation, any person or belief that threatened the established power structure, whether religious, economic, or gendered. The witch trial was less a legal inquiry and more an instrument of social purification, wielded by those who held the keys to dogma. The entire event operated on a devastating psychological principle: the substitution of accountability for spectacle. It felt cathartic to witness the downfall of another, to be part of the collective cleansing ritual. And this feeling was profoundly intoxicating for both victim and spectator alike. They were complicit in the terror, even if they hadn't wielded the flames themselves. Ultimately, the trial format itself was a triumph of performance over justice. It taught us that when foundational belief systems are questioned, and when systemic power demands unquestioning loyalty, the law does not act as a shield against chaos. It becomes the most efficient machine for manufacturing it. The deepest scar left by these trials was the realization that sometimes the greatest horror is simply man's profound capacity to weaponize suspicion in the name of piety. The court was merely the polished edge of society's paranoia, but the true gathering of evidence often took place at the periphery, in the places that existed outside the written law and the stained Gothic arches of the church. It was where civilization ended and instinct began, at the forest edge. The woods were not just scenery, they were a repository for dread, a breathing space for suspicion to root itself and take hold. When formal justice failed, when the legal system demanded performance rather than truth, people looked to the wilderness for confirmation of their deepest fears. The bog, the dark patch of woodland, these spaces became repositories of monstrous knowledge. The investigation moved beyond the interrogation room's sterile cruelty. Instead, it ventured into the muck and shadow. Here, the evidence was rarely a signed confession or a piece of textile. It was visceral, often gruesome, demanding methods that hovered between ritualistic examination and desperate torture. People believed that by peeling back the layers of the body or observing its unnatural decay in the damp earth, they could find proof of infernal taint. This gathering of evidence was less an act of detective work and more a participatory nightmare. Accusers were often required to physically participate in detecting the devil's influence. They would track phantom signs through the undergrowth, interpret strange animal behaviors as divine warnings, or search for markings that purportedly linked the accused to non-human entities. The methods used defied modern concepts of jurisprudence. There was the examination of entrails, divination, in its most brutal form. The belief persisted that internal organs held clues, not just about health, but about moral corruption, capable of reflecting pacts signed with darkness. A supposed abnormality in a liver or lung was enough to confirm the worst suspicions. Similarly, accused individuals might be subjected to forced confessions detailing journeys to hell or secret meetings with demonic patrons, narratives woven from fear and pain until they attained an undeniable conviction. The forest itself became the grandest witness and the cruelest judge. It provided both the illusion of objective truth, the tangible dirt underfoot, the ominous whisper carried on the wind, and the perfect cover for atrocity. In this setting, suspicion was given a pseudo-scientific patina by practitioners who claimed specialized knowledge. Herbalists corrupted into witch hunters, charlatans claiming divine insight, and desperate locals believing they were performing an act of spiritual cleansing. The legal loopholes that initially allowed minor accusations to snowball found their ultimate expression here. If the physical surroundings seemed tainted, the earth was too sour. The stream flowed with unusual bitterness. It suggested a deep, systemic corruption, traceable perhaps back to one specific individual polluting, not just the well, but the soul of the community. The process ensured that suspicion was never treated as a casual thought crime. It became a physical reality. It was an ordeal designed to extract confirmation of guilt from environments and bodies alike. Those accused were often forced to undergo tests of endurance, requiring them to prove their innocence in hostile, natural settings, sometimes through walking gauntlets or surviving exposure. Failure to perform the required performance solidified the accuser's sense of righteousness and increased the pressure on the suspect until it broke bone and spirit. The woods amplified misogynistic bias that had already been established in theory. The forest was traditionally associated with liminality, a space outside masculine control, the realm of wild women, healing knowledge, and untamed female power. To accuse a woman found wandering or gathering herbs at the edge meant accusing her of crossing the boundary between permissible folk magic and outright demonic threat. Her knowledge became inherently suspect, her solitude incriminating. This was a highly ritualized drama played out against the backdrop of nature's cold indifference. Every snapped twig, every unusual patch of moldy fungus could be interpreted as a signifier. The accuser wasn't merely reporting what they saw. They were actively constructing the reality of witchcraft through their intense need for certainty and control. They found patterns where none existed, weaving a tapestry of malice from circumstantial detail. The desperation of both the accusers and the accused was palpable. For the accuser, identifying evil in nature offered a profound sense of temporary intellectual superiority. They were enlightened detectives, saving the soul of their community. For the accused, however, it meant facing an abyss where truth was irrelevant. and survival depended entirely on managing the collective hysteria of a fearful age. What emerged from these deep investigations into the forest muck was not justice. It was theater, a deeply unsettling performance designed to satisfy the communal need for an enemy. The woodland witch hunt demonstrated that in times of profound crisis, famine, plague, or political upheaval, the most dangerous accusations are those constructed when faith is merely profitable paranoia, finding justification for violence where only fear can be found. The cycle of suspicion was vast and deep, fueled by fear and etched into the very fabric of medieval life. But to understand how profoundly devastating these hunts became, we must pull back from the desperation of the accused and look, instead, at those who held the levers of power, the true conduits through which paranoia transformed into deadly law. The witch hunt, in its peak, was not merely a superstitious outburst. It was an industry funded, managed, and profited from by the educated elite. Bishops, powerful merchant guilds, secular magistrates, and academic jurists alike. To whom did this lethal energy flow? It flowed to those who could write the law, interpret scripture, or profit from the confiscation of property. This chapter confronts the uncomfortable truth that often separates genuine spiritual fervor from cold, hard financial calculation. The authority structures, the church's legal bureaucracy, and the burgeoning power of regional city-states found in the accusation of witchcraft a perfect, devastating tool of social control. It was an explanation for everything from poor harvest to mercantile competition, and unlike many other forms of dissent or failure, it provided spectacular evidence, confessions, spectral visions, and physical signs of pacts. The legal framework itself was fundamentally compromised. Laws concerning heresy and sorcery were not static texts. They were highly adaptable instruments that could be applied selectively to eliminate rivals, critics, or simply those whose land or resources were coveted. A witch trial often functioned as a grand clearing out, a method by which powerful entities resolved disputes that would have previously required messy, expensive, and politically charged public feuds. Consider the role of local nobility and wealthy merchant families. When faced with economic stagnation or internal dissent within their communities, accusing an outsider, particularly one from a rival family, or a dissenting professional class, such as healers or apothecaries, served multiple purposes. It was not just about purifying the bloodline. It was often about seizing assets, land deeds, and intellectual property disguised as supernatural taint. The magical contamination became collateral damage in a dispute over real estate. The clergy's involvement adds another layer of complexity. Bishops and powerful monastic orders were deeply invested in defining orthodoxy. Witchcraft accusations allowed them to reinforce their own theological authority by positioning themselves as the sole interpreters between man, God, and the terrifying void represented by malevolent magic. They funded inquisitions, paid for expert testimony, and circulated the manuals of accusation, thereby maintaining an intellectual monopoly over fear itself. But the scope extended beyond mere piety or property disputes. The established legal mechanisms proved to be voracious and utterly indifferent to truth. Due process was a concept malleable enough to stretch until it snapped under the weight of hysteria. Accusations could leap across social strata, from peasants in remote fields to courtly women with advanced education, provided they deviated from accepted norms or held inconvenient knowledge. The investigation became less about establishing guilt and more about generating an acceptable narrative that suited the prevailing political climate. This confluence of law, theology, and commerce created a highly lucrative ecosystem for professional malice. Those who were skilled at writing, interpreting ambiguous texts, conducting interrogations, and mastering the performance of judicial authority thrived. They became the power brokers, the scribes creating the records, the lawyers presenting the loopholes, and the priests sanctifying the violence. Their livelihoods depended entirely on the continuation of fear itself. The ultimate tragedy embedded in this system was that it required a surrender of rationality. It demanded that intelligent people, academics, jurists, theologians, participate enthusiastically in what they intellectually knew to be absurdity. They built elaborate theories connecting astral bodies, menstrual cycles, and contractual agreements with Satan, not out of genuine belief, but out of self-preservation within the rigid structure of their class. To question the process was to admit intellectual failure. Silence and compliance were mandatory for advancement. This realization that many witch hunts were less about devil's pacts and more about jurisdictional disagreements between powerful landholders or economic maneuvering by competing merchant guilds is perhaps the darkest lesson history can offer. The accusation became a corporate tool, turning piety into profit and theological duty into sheer opportunism. It taught that even in moments of purported divine judgment, human greed and systemic control are far more reliably destructive than any mythical evil. The hunt did not always begin with overt malice. Often, it was triggered by minor transgressions, a healer practicing medicine outside guild boundaries, a woman speaking too freely about political matters, or simply challenging the social hierarchy. But once the legal machinery of suspicion was fully oiled and funded by those in power, these minor cracks became catastrophic fissures, demanding mass accusations to maintain structural integrity. Having seen how suspicion could become a profitable enterprise for the elite, we must now look at who was actually caught in this sweeping net. The witch hunts were not indiscriminate blazes consuming all segments of society. They were highly specific targeting mechanisms. They had victims, certainly, but more accurately, they had archetypes, demographics defined by deviation. These suspects were rarely accused for the crimes they purportedly committed. Instead, their alleged sin lay in who they were, what they knew, or simply where they lived. The most immediate and pervasive target was women. But not just any woman. It was the woman existing outside the neat boundaries of marriage and property, the unmarried widow with excess time, the herb worker whose knowledge stemmed from forgotten traditions, or the midwife whose skills allowed her access to private suffering. These were the people who possessed unusual autonomy. Autonomy in a patriarchal society meant being inherently suspicious. The law needed them vulnerable. It needed their unique forms of labor and expertise, the healing herbs, the complex weaving patterns, the oral histories, to be filed down, neutralized, and rendered powerless. The next class of suspects were those who deviated intellectually or professionally. Consider the poor itinerant scholar or the barber surgeon whose practical knowledge crossed established medical lines. Their skills might have been innovative, challenging the settled authority of the university physician or the local priest. They represented a form of inconvenient knowledge, a secular wisdom that could not be cataloged or controlled by established dogma. The structure of suspicion was thus built upon difference, deviation from gender norms, deviation from accepted medicine, and most potently, deviation from absolute submission to ecclesiastical authority. The witch hunts succeeded because they codified otherness. They created a social fiction in which natural variation was interpreted as diabolical collusion. As we move into the deep countryside, away from the visible structures of the magistrate's court or the church, suspicion becomes more intimate and less institutional. It travels down family lines, clinging to marginalized communities, the beggars, the wanderers, the poor peasants who lacked land titles or established kinship networks. They were a physical embodiment of social fluidity, something deeply unsettling to the feudal order that valued static property boundaries and rigid class structures. The accusation often followed knowledge. The herbalist who knew which root could cure a fever, but also which might induce madness. The peasant woman who spoke local dialect mixed with ancient rites. These women were keepers of communal memory and ecological knowledge, a knowledge base entirely outside the purview of canon law or Latin scholarship. To accuse them was to simultaneously destroy their livelihood, erase their accumulated wisdom, and reaffirm the absolute dominion of the governing class. The pattern established here is chillingly consistent. When a society faces overwhelming stress, blight, plague, economic instability, it does not look inward for solutions, it looks outward for blame. And once that external scapegoat, the devil, has been identified, the process merely descends to identifying suitable carriers of that sin. The most devastating aspect of this targeting was its systemic pattern of minimizing actual crime. The accuser rarely needed proof of malice or ritual sacrifice. They only required evidence of potential deviation. A woman who used foxglove could be accused of witchcraft. A child who possessed unusual intuition could be blamed for summoning infernal mischief. The bar for condemnation was lowered not by the law, but by generalized panic. This created what we might call the porous suspicion. It meant that any perceived weakness, a moment of emotional distress, an instance of economic failure, even a simple physical difference could become evidence of profound spiritual corruption. The suspect pool expanded to encompass anyone who failed to perfectly conform. The overly outspoken woman, the poor man unable to repay debts, the peasant whose children were destined for field labor rather than guild apprenticeship. What is so powerful about this mechanism is its camouflage. At first glance, the trials appear motivated by piety, by a genuine desire to save souls and protect divine order. This moral veneer allows both the accuser and the system to feel righteous while performing profoundly destructive acts of social pruning. It masks systemic control as spiritual necessity. The consequence for the accused was almost never straightforward execution. Often, the first phase was one of total dismantling, the interrogation, the coerced confession, the institutional erasure of identity. They were stripped of their community standing, questioned until they doubted their own memories, and then subjected to physical scrutiny meant to find signs of the devil's mark or foreign influence. They weren't merely guilty of witchcraft, they were found wanting as members of society. They represented a social debt that the local order sought to collect through fire. The dust left behind was not just ash, but the remains of community trust itself scattered across acres, where once there had been neighborly reliance and shared vulnerability. This constant state of threat, the ever-present specter of being deemed other, was perhaps the most profound trauma. It taught entire communities that their deepest fears were not simply random bad luck or natural cycles. They were forces capable of malignant, targeted malice, manageable only by ritual purification and absolute adherence to established power structures. And thus, the narrative continues from this foundation of pervasive suspicion, leading us into the terrifying process of constructing fabricated proof of these invisible evils. We have tracked the paranoia from the fields and the celestial charts into the confined spaces of the court and the interrogator's office. The investigation, we learned, was less about gathering factual evidence and more about creating a narrative that could sustain the hysteria. When accusation became an industry, confessing became the only commodity with real value. And so, we arrive at what many feared most, the document, the devil's pact. These alleged contracts represent the deepest intersection of human despair, institutional need, and phenomenal forgery. The accusation is a thing of monumental weight. Yet, in the bowels of the local castle, or the dim chamber of the town magistrate, the process that follows is governed by far less than justice. The arrest itself is merely prelude to something infinitely more brutal, the interrogation. This was not an inquiry meant to uncover truth. It was designed first and foremost to extract a confession. A confession, in this dark calculus, was not merely admitting guilt. It was the ultimate form of submission, the moment when the individual's personal reality collapsed under the weight of institutional terror. The interrogation chamber functioned as a meticulously constructed psychological cage. It smelled of sweat, fear, stale wine, and burning herbs, a cocktail of anxiety designed to break the spirit before any physical strain began. The rules were fluid, dictated not by established law, but by the momentary whim of the interrogator or the escalating panic within the courtroom. The objective was always the same: shatter the accused's sense of self, making them a pliable vessel for the narrative that powerful men required. Days dissolved into an unending cycle of psychological torment. Sleep deprivation became a primary tool. The condemned were kept awake, often subjected to grueling questioning by varying parties, bishops who spoke in theological certainty, magistrates obsessed with legal procedure, and sometimes their own neighbors who offered helpful recollections. This systematic assault on the circadian rhythm did more than just induce exhaustion. It eroded critical thought. It created gaps in memory, blurring the lines between what had truly happened and what had been implanted by sheer force of will. As the investigation proceeded into its darkest phases, questioning shifted from simple accusations of malice to demanding the full topography of a cosmic betrayal, the detailed accounts of pacts with hell, the names of co-conspirators across distant lands, and the rituals performed in secret woods. The interrogator did not ask questions to gather facts. They asked them to build a comprehensive myth. Every detail provided was woven into a tapestry of perfect villainy, solidifying both the accuser's conviction and the accused's utter despair. The breaking point was often triggered by methods that operated outside even the wildest definitions of medieval law. Though torture itself had its own documented practices, the goal here was never merely physical pain. It was performance, the spectacle of unbearable suffering, designed to make resistance psychologically impossible. From rack and thumbscrew, which inflicted precise agony calibrated for maximum informational yield, to more esoteric methods that played on sensory deprivation or forced confrontation with fear, every tool served the same end: achieving a confession that was detailed, damning, and absolutely comprehensive. The accused were trapped in a devastating paradox. To maintain their innocence meant enduring an endless barrage of baseless accusations and relentless torment. To yield, to break under the weight of exhaustion and terror, seemed momentarily safer than facing the void of doubt. The forced confession became a tragic performance, the individual reciting the narrative others needed them to confess, not because it was true, but because continued silence was punished by an escalation of cruelty. This breakdown exposed the deep vulnerability of the human psyche when confronted with systemic paranoia. It revealed how easily reason could be dismantled, not by brute force alone, but by a steady, insidious erosion of emotional and intellectual resilience. The mind, starved of rest and safety, begins to accept reality as whatever it is told it should be. It was in these agonizing nights of interrogation that the true horror of the witch hunts materialized. They were not trials for justice, but industrial mechanisms of psychological collapse. They functioned by proving something far more terrifying than witchcraft existed. They proved that under duress, under the constant threat of absolute destruction, the individual would sacrifice their own truth simply to make the suffering stop. The confession itself, therefore, was a masterpiece of shared terror. It validated the accuser's fears, justified the authorities' power, and provided the necessary legal pretext for the spectacular conclusion. By the dawn that followed these nights, the accused had not only confirmed the existence of malevolent forces, they had become complicit in their own undoing, signing away their very reality on parchment stained by manufactured desperation. This surrender of self was the final, most damning piece of evidence. The flames eventually died down. The smell of burnt kindling and roasted flesh hung thick in the autumn air, a noxious curtain obscuring any semblance of peace. What remained was not justice, but ash, a gray, choking reminder of catastrophic failure. We stand now at the edge of fields where nothing has grown for years, where the whispers have finally dwindled to an exhausted silence. The hysteria that consumed these communities did not end with the hanging. It simply found a more insidious form of persistence. It settled into the bone, becoming a quiet, heavy burden carried by those who survived. The pyres cooled, leaving behind victims whose names were erased from the record, their lives reduced to chemical elements in the soil. The tangible evidence was gone, but the cultural infrastructure built upon fear remained remarkably resilient. This realization that the structure of suspicion outlived the accused is perhaps the most unsettling historical truth of all. We are left with a society fundamentally changed, marked by an agonizing withdrawal into itself. Trust had been weaponized and spent in the crucible of accusation. Every handshake, every shared loaf of bread now carried the invisible weight of potential betrayal. The neighbor who once relied on you for help harvesting the wheat now viewed your generosity through the lens of suspicion, wondering if it was merely a trap laid by an unseen enemy. The covenant was no longer with God and man, but with perpetual self-monitoring. The greatest horror, as we realize now, lay not in the fire that consumed their bodies, nor even in the legal pronouncements signed in terror. It resided instead in the sustained ability to convince oneself of invisible evil, the intellectual willingness to substitute verifiable reality for a compelling narrative of damnation. To accept the devil's machinations required an extraordinary and permanent surrender of rational thought. Look closely at what has survived, not artifacts, but the psychological residue of fear. The institutional success was achieved when individuals were willing to believe that cosmic malice could genuinely infect their local water sources or spoil a child's milk. This belief structure did not require evidence. It required only the authority to assign blame. The power wielded by the accusers, the ministers, the magistrates, even the desperate villagers who found temporary release in outrage, was rooted in this collective capacity for profitable paranoia. They demonstrated that deep-seated communal anxieties regarding plague, famine, and social displacement could be channeled into a highly destructive, yet perfectly manageable, state-sponsored industry of accusation. The concept we must grapple with is not merely faith, but belief itself. When religious conviction shifts its focus from spiritual guidance to the identification and elimination of physical scapegoats, it transforms into something purely political and tragically profitable. The hunt for witches was less a pursuit of damnation than an act of social pruning, a brutal mechanism by which established power structures excised inconvenient people, intellectual challenges, or mere statistical outliers. Consider the quiet aftermath on this scale. The authorities left behind not a clean slate, but a field riddled with profound vacuum. Expertise in herbal remedies became suspect. Women who possessed independent knowledge or defied patriarchal constraints found their skills indistinguishable from black magic. The simple act of questioning authority, whether a priest's teaching or a magistrate's decree, was grounds for existential accusation. The burden left to the surviving community was therefore twofold. First, the emotional weight of grief and guilt. Second, the ongoing necessity of maintaining vigilance because memory is unreliable and trauma distorts reality. The line between justifiable caution and debilitating paranoia proved incredibly thin, almost non-existent. The enduring legacy of these hunts is a pervasive skepticism toward communal narrative. It teaches us that when systems fail, when medicine fails, when crops die unexpectedly, when wars rage unchecked, the human mind possesses an alarming gift for creating unified causality. It demands a single, tangible villain to restore the illusion of order. The devil, or some equally potent scapegoat, became functionally efficient because he could be pointed at, formalized by law and ritually eliminated. And so, as we draw our conclusion from this smoky era of terror, we must reject the easy romance of tragedy. This was not a saga of pure good versus absolute evil. It was far muddier, more complicated, and ultimately driven by the cynical arithmetic of power. It was an enterprise where theological paranoia intersected perfectly with economic self-interest, creating a legal vacuum that allowed accusation to become both a moral duty and a financial asset for the ruling class. The ash remains. It tells us nothing beautiful, only the terrible fact that once suspicion is institutionalized, it becomes a far more enduring force than any purifying flame. The belief itself, the sheer, intoxicating pleasure of being convinced one has witnessed true evil, was the final